That night, the suburban sky was thick with clouds, heavy with the promise of a storm. Madison stood by the living room window, absently swirling a glass of red wine in her hand. Her eyes drifted aimlessly, catching the faint, blurred glimmer of streetlights in the darkness. Jack was gone again, another business trip that would keep him away until the weekend. It was just her and Ethan alone in the large, hollow house. A faint sound broke the oppressive silence, floating down from upstairs. Madison stiffened, carefully placing her wineglass on the table as she strained to listen. The noise was indistinct, not footsteps, nor the faint rhythm of music that sometimes played from Ethan's room. A knot of curiosity formed in her chest, pulling her toward the staircase. The soft yellow glow seeped faintly from Ethan's door, cracked open just enough to leak light into the hallway. Barefoot, her movements were slow and deliberate as she tread over the cold wooden floor. The faint creak of the boards echoed underfoot. She paused at his door, raising her hand to knock, but hesitated. Peering through the narrow gap, the sight before her rooted her in place. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his shoulders slightly hunched, cradling something in his hands that she couldn't quite make out. The dim light from the bedside lamp stretched his shadow across the walls, blending the ordinary with the surreal. But it wasn't the scene that held her frozen, it was the expression on Ethan's face. Sadness weighed heavy on his features, an unguarded, raw sorrow Madison had never seen before. His eyes locked onto the object in his hands with a focus so intense it seemed as though an invisible battle raged within him. She felt a pang of guilt for watching him like this, for intruding on a moment so private. Yet the vulnerability etched on his face, the fragile pain he displayed without pretense, kept her there. This side of Ethan was unfamiliar, so unlike anything she'd seen, one she doubted anyone else had. Madison. Ethan's voice shattered the stillness, pulling her abruptly back to reality. His gaze turned toward her, catching her standing there. She froze at the doorway, gripping the frame as an awkward silence settled between them. His eyes, a complicated mix of emotions, met hers, both enclosing the moment and breaking it apart. With a mix of surprise and embarrassment, Ethan hastily set the worn photo frame down on the bed, clearly not wanting her to see it. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," Madison said, her voice shaky as she struggled to remain calm. Ethan drew a deep breath, his eyes shifting away from her before returning to the frame. "It's fine," he muttered. "I just didn't think you'd come up here." "What's the photo of?" Madison asked gently, taking a small step closer. Her voice was softer now. She didn't want to push him, but the glimpse of vulnerability had sparked an instinctive curiosity. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, a long silence stretching between them, as though he were weighing his words carefully. Finally, he picked up the frame again, his thumb brushing over the worn wooden edge. "It's my mom," he said quietly, his voice distant. "I don't know why, but I've been thinking about her a lot tonight." A quiet ache stirred in Madison's chest. There was something raw in his tone, a restrained weight that resonated with her deeply. She stepped closer, her eyes falling on the photograph. It was an image of a young woman with a gentle smile that seemed to hold the warmth of sunlight. Yet her eyes were filled with something quieter, deeper, like a reflection of her thoughts. Madison couldn't help but notice how much Ethan resembled her, not just in his features, but in the quiet melancholy they both seemed to carry. "You don't have to hide how you feel around me," Madison said softly. "Sometimes sharing can make things a little easier." Ethan chuckled faintly, the sound bitter. A fleeting smile flickered on his lips, only to disappear just as quickly. "Do you really believe that?" he'd asked, his eyes meeting hers, a sharp mix of doubt and vulnerability in his gaze. "When you don't share anything with anyone." Ethan's words hit her like a sudden gust of wind, leaving Madison momentarily speechless. His piercing gray-blue eyes locked with hers, stripping away the defenses she had so carefully built. The air between them grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension neither could name. A connection that felt both forbidden and magnetic. It wasn't anger or judgment in his gaze, but something deeper, something that made it impossible to step back from the moment they had unwittingly stumbled into. Madison returned to the living room after her brief encounter with Ethan, but her thoughts remained anchored to the image of him sitting on the bed, his eyes brimming with sorrow as he stared at the photograph. The scene continued to echo in her mind, tugging at emotions she thought had been buried long ago. Pouring herself another glass of wine, she sank into the couch, allowing the past to come rushing back. She remembered meeting Jack for the first time, a man of unshakable confidence, ambition, and an irresistible charm that seemed to draw everyone in. Their whirlwind romance was intoxicating, and within months, he had proposed. At the time, Madison believed she had found her forever, but marriage revealed cracks she never anticipated. Jack's relentless need for adoration and his high expectations didn't stop at his career. They seeped into every facet of their life, including their relationship. Once passionate and full of life, Madison had been a vibrant woman who lost herself along the way. Writing had been her anchor. Ethan fought tirelessly to live up to Jack's impossible standards of perfection. Despite his unwavering efforts, Madison could see the toll it took, each attempt eroding pieces of who he was, leaving behind a fragile shell of a boy transitioning into manhood. Her mind drifted to a night from years ago. She had found Ethan alone in the backyard, bathed in the dim yellow glow of a street lamp. He was strumming a worn guitar, the strings weaving a soft, melancholic melody that lingered in the air like a secret. For the first time, Madison saw a glimpse of Ethan's true self, raw, vulnerable, and achingly honest. But when she called his name, he froze. Without a word, he packed the guitar away and slipped back into the house, as though caught in an act he wasn't meant to perform. That moment stayed with her. From then on, she paid closer attention to Ethan. Beyond his quiet demeanor, she noticed a storm of emotions he kept hidden, a voice yearning to be heard but silenced by fear and expectations. Madison took a deep breath, her gaze falling to the wine glass she held. She understood Ethan's struggles better than anyone, because she was drowning in the same current. The heavy weight of unspoken expectations, the suffocating feeling of living a life that wasn't truly hers. But unlike Ethan, she had already surrendered. She had given up the fight and resigned herself to this existence, convinced that escape was no longer possible. Madison knew Ethan was different. While her life felt like it was set in stone, he still had time. A faint but undeniable spark still burned within him. That spark, flickering though it was, captivated her completely. Sitting in the quiet living room, Madison realized she and Ethan shared more than just a house. They shared a deep, unspoken pain, a mutual feeling of being trapped somewhere between their true selves and the expectations imposed by others. She felt it in her chest. This was something uncharted, a connection so strong it blurred the lines between right and wrong. And yet she couldn't resist the pull, the gravity that seemed to draw her closer to him with each passing moment. The next night, Madison woke abruptly at 2 a.m., an unshakable unease pressing heavily on her chest. Sleep was nowhere to be found as her mind looped relentlessly through the hollow shell of her life. Jack's growing distance, the sorrow etched in Ethan's eyes during last night's conversation, and the weight of everything unspoken. Finally, unable to bear her restless thoughts, Madison decided to make her way to the kitchen for tea, hoping the calm of the night might offer her peace. But as she descended the stairs, a faint sound drew her attention. Light spilled softly from the living room, where she saw Ethan sitting on the couch, his back turned to her, shoulders slumped under a weight that seemed insurmountable. He hadn't even changed out of his clothes. He sat there, still and silent, and in that moment, Madison's heart etched for him in a way she couldn't explain. The same light gray t-shirt as before, his hair slightly tousled, and a nearly empty bottle of red wine sat beside him on the coffee table. Madison paused, conflicted between retreating and stepping forward. Finally, she moved. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly, her voice tentative, careful not to disturb the delicate stillness. Ethan flinched at the sound of her voice, turning to look at her with surprise, but his expression quickly softened. "What about you?" he replied, his voice hoarse, as though he had been lost in a long conversation with himself. She crossed the room, settling in the chair across from him. "The night feels unusually long," she said, her eyes drifting to the bottle on the table. "Are you okay?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, driven by the growing need to understand the man sitting before her. Ethan gave a faint laugh, devoid of any humor. "Too much on my mind," he admitted, his fingers running along the edge of the table as if to steady himself. "My dad called tonight." His voice tightened. "He wants me to change my major to business." "Of course he does. It's the practical choice. But I don't want that." Madison felt her chest tighten. Jack's demands didn't surprise her, but the helplessness in Ethan's voice cut deeper than she expected. "Did you tell him that?" she asked, leaning forward, her gaze fixed firmly on him. Ethan shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "What's the point?" he said quietly. "He doesn't listen. He never has. I'll never be good enough for him. I'm just a failed copy of him." Madison watched him carefully, her heart heavy as she noticed the pain and anger etched into his expression, emotions he had buried for far too long. At that moment, she didn't just see the young man in front of her. She saw someone crushed by the weight of unreasonable expectations, someone fighting the same unseen battle she herself had known all too well. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand resting gently on his trembling one. "You don't have to be like your father," she said softly. "You don't have to live your life on his terms. This life is yours, Ethan." Her words made him freeze. Ethan glanced down at her hand, her fingertips barely grazing his skin. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Madison didn't pull away, and Ethan didn't flinch. The air between them grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension, undeniable like a storm gathering on the horizon. "Madison," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with the weight of a choice he wasn't ready to make. Part of him wanted to retreat, to protect the fragile boundary that existed between them. Yet another part, the part he kept hidden deep inside, longed to draw closer. Madison hesitated. She knew she should pull her hand away, leave the moment behind and retreat upstairs where nothing would change. But Ethan's eyes, filled with raw pain and an aching need for connection, held her in place. They stirred something deep within her, an echo of a loneliness she had tried to bury long ago. For that fleeting instant, they were no longer bound by labels of stepmother and stepson. They were simply two souls, seeking understanding in the spaces where words had failed. Two lost souls searching for belonging. Ethan hesitated, the weight of his inner battle evident, but the moment his fingers gently curled over Madison's hand, the hesitation seemed to fade. Madison stayed motionless, her words trapped in her throat, but her rapid breathing betrayed the storm inside her. When their eyes finally locked, the rest of the world seemed to fall away, dissolving into the charged silence between them. "I know this is wrong," Ethan murmured, a confession weighed down with conflicting emotions. "But I can't stop myself. I can't stop thinking about you." Madison's throat tightened, her response caught somewhere between fear and longing. Before she could stop herself, her body leaned closer to his, erasing the fragile distance between them. When their lips met, tentative at first, then consumed by urgency, it was an eruption of everything they'd suppressed. And in that moment, Madison knew a line had been crossed, one that could never be undone. But more than that, she also understood this wasn't a fleeting moment of weakness. It was the start of something that terrified her, something she didn't yet have the words for. The next morning, golden sunlight filtered through the curtains, turning the living room into a soft haze of light. Madison stirred on the sofa, a light blanket draped over her. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if everything had been a dream. But the lingering warmth on her lips and the persistent pounding of her heart reminded her otherwise. Ethan was gone. He had left before she woke, leaving Madison to wrestle alone with her spiraling thoughts. Throwing herself into busy work around the house, she tried, and failed, to erase the previous night from her mind. Lost in her thoughts, the sudden chime of the doorbell startled her. When Madison opened the door, her best friend Lily stood on the porch, radiant as always, with 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. "Hey, you okay? You look different," Lily said, her sharp eyes scanning Madison's face with unmistakable suspicion. Madison forced a weak smile, shaking her head as though she could dispel Lily's concern. But Lily wasn't one to drop things so easily. Before Madison could answer, the sound of deliberate footsteps echoed on the stairs. "Ethan." Madison froze, her pulse quickening as he appeared. Her heart raced, thudding so forcefully it felt as though it might break through her chest. Ethan's gaze flickered briefly toward her, a hint of discomfort crossing his face before he quickly masked it with a practiced nonchalance. Lily's sharp eyes shifted between Ethan and Madison, lingering for a moment before locking onto Madison with quiet intensity. She didn't utter a word, yet the air in the room grew heavy with unspoken tension, pressing down on all 3 of them. Madison worked hard to hide the turmoil beneath the surface, but Lily seemed to catch every nuance. Without another word, Ethan grabbed his keys, muttered a clipped goodbye, and disappeared out the door. The click of the door echoed in the silence, a punctuation to the moment's unease. Lily seated herself beside Madison, her expression edged with curiosity and suspicion. "You can't hide from me," Lily said, slicing through the quiet with a voice sharp and certain. "There's something going on between you and Ethan, isn't there?" Madison opened her mouth, ready to refute the accusation, but the words clung to her throat, refusing to surface. Lily didn't look away, her stare like a blade cutting through the fragile front Madison clung to. I don't know what to say," Madison finally murmured, her voice feather-light and trembling. Lily leaned back slightly, her usual carefree posture replaced by an uncommon seriousness. She set a firm but steady hand on Madison's shoulder, her tone soft yet unyielding. "You know this can't go on, right? What if Jack finds out? Or worse, what if Ethan gets hurt? Have you thought about the fallout, Madison? Really thought about it?" Her words struck Madison like lightning, shattering the walls she had tried to build around her guilt. All the questions she had been desperately pushing aside now surged forward, blocking out any semblance of calm. She felt as though she was standing on the precipice of something vast and terrifying, staring into a chasm filled with consequences she could barely begin to fathom. Before she could respond, the front door creaked open. Jack entered, his presence like an icy draft that filled the room. And Madison froze, standing stiffly as if bracing for impact. "You're home early," she stammered, the steadiness of her voice betraying her growing unease. Jack offered a smile, but it was devoid of any warmth. His eyes scanned the room with a sharp precision that left her feeling exposed. "Work wrapped up sooner than I thought," he replied casually, though an underlying edge in his tone hinted at something more. His calculating gaze flicked over to Lily, then swept back to Madison. "Where's Ethan?" Jack asked, his voice cold and measured. Madison's pulse quickened. "He just stepped out," Lily interjected smoothly, attempting to diffuse the tension. But Jack wasn't so easily appeased. He turned his piercing eyes back to Madison, leaning in just enough to make her feel cornered. "I feel like I'm missing something here," Jack said quietly, his tone low but ominous. Madison forced a smile, but beneath Jack's sharp, unwavering gaze, she felt completely exposed. Every lie she had told, every secret she had kept seemed to hang in the air between them. Sensing the tension, Lily quickly excused herself, slipping out the door and leaving Madison alone with him. The moment the door clicked shut, Jack stepped closer, his expression darker, his presence heavier. "You're hiding something, aren't you?" he asked, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "I'm not," Madison replied, but her trembling voice betrayed her attempt to sound convincing. Jack stood still, his eyes locked on hers, searching, demanding the truth she couldn't articulate. "You and Ethan," Jack continued, quieter now but infinitely more menacing. "There's something you're not telling me, isn't there?" Her silence spoke volumes, though her lips remained sealed. Jack's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. I trusted you. I trusted you with everything. And now, I don't even know if I can believe a word you say." The accusation hit Madison like a punch to the chest. Her breath became shallow, uneven, panic welling up inside her. She wanted to deny it, to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. She knew she couldn't undo what had already been done. Jack turned away, his body tense, his movements deliberate as he walked to the window. He stood there, his gaze fixed on something distant and unreachable. His voice, cold and final, cut through the thick, suffocating air. "If what I'm thinking is true, then this, whatever we had, it's over. It ends here." The words landed with devastating force, leaving her reeling. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything she had so desperately tried to keep together was unraveling right before her eyes. And then he was gone. The door slammed shut behind him, his footsteps echoing down the hall until they faded, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Madison sank onto the sofa, gripping the cushions as if they could anchor her to reality. Jack's parting words looped in her mind, sharp as broken glass, cutting deeper with every repetition. The choices she had made, the line she had crossed with Ethan, they were irreversible, and the consequences were hurtling toward her like a tidal wave. She sat there for what felt like hours, consumed by guilt, fear, and the crushing weight of what she had lost. When she finally lifted her head, it was to a quiet, empty room, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. The damage had been done, and now, she had to face whatever came next. The light outside the window faded into the soft grays of dusk. Part of her wanted to run, to leave everything behind, but another part knew she couldn't. This was something she had to face. Ethan returned when the sky was fully dark. He stepped into the house to find Madison sitting motionless on the sofa, her eyes red and swollen. The tension in the room was palpable, and Ethan hesitated. "What happened?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Madison looked up, meeting his gaze. A wave of emotion surged through her, overwhelming and impossible to suppress. "Jack knows," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan froze, his body rigid. He moved closer, taking a seat beside her but keeping a careful distance. "What did he say?" he asked, cautiously. Madison shook her head, fighting back a fresh wave of tears. "He didn't say it outright, but he knows something is going on between us. He warned me, even if it's true, everything is over." Her voice broke, and she turned to Ethan, her wide eyes filled with fear. "And he's right. This is wrong. It always was." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He stared at the floor, his fists clenched tightly in his lap as he processed her words. "Madison," he began, his voice shaky, unsure of what to say. "You don't have to say anything," Madison interrupted, her tone now steadier, more resolute. "We were wrong from the start, Ethan. I've known it all along, but I ignored it. I was caught up in my feelings, and I made the mistake of letting them lead me." Ethan's gaze was filled with raw pain as he turned to Madison, his voice trembling. "You're trying to push me away, aren't you?" he said. Madison drew in a deep breath, steadying herself. "Not because I want to," she replied, her tone firm, "but because we have to. I've hurt Jack, I've hurt myself, and I'm terrified I'll end up hurting you too." Her words hung heavy in the space between them. Ethan wanted to fight, to hold on to what they had, but he couldn't deny the truth in her voice. They'd crossed too many lines, and all that remained was the fallout. The next morning, Madison made her decision. She packed a small bag, leaving a letter for Jack on the kitchen counter. It was brief, no justifications or extended explanations, just a heartfelt apology for the pain she had caused. With a sharp ache in her chest and a faint sense of relief, she stepped out of the house. Ethan didn't try to stop her. From the foot of the stairs, he watched her leave, silently resisting the urge to call her back. Deep down, he'd understood. This distance was necessary for them to find themselves again. Behind the wheel, Madison didn't look back. Though she felt Ethan's gaze lingering, she stayed resolute. She needed this space to heal the wounds she'd inflicted, both on others and herself. Yet a part of her knew Ethan had changed her forever. He had reminded her of who she was before she became someone she barely recognized. Time passed, and in the quiet solitude she'd chosen, Madison began to rediscover herself. She returned to her writing, pouring out the emotions she had once buried. She didn't reach out to Jack or Ethan, but carried them both in her heart, knowing their roles in shaping her story were undeniable. One late summer afternoon, she received a letter from Ethan. It was simple yet sincere. "Thank you for helping me realize that sometimes freedom comes from letting go. I hope you find your own freedom too." Tears slid down her cheeks as she placed the letter in her journal, a keepsake for the moments that mattered most. And then she moved forward, not with Jack, not with Ethan, but with herself. It was a new path, one defined by hope, freedom, and the love she had finally learned to give herself.